From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, June 24th, 2015. South Sudan is spiraling into crisis as the world's newest nation struggles with unspeakable atrocities. We'll turn to analyst Sufyan bin Uzayr to understand what is happening. And in Uganda, one women's rights activist and civil engineer is bringing hope through her efforts at water conservation and self-determination. We'll speak with Godliver Businge. Plus, author Nomi Prins will examine GOP presidential candidate Jeb Bush and the Bush family's ties to Wall Street. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris, Assistant Professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
WikiLeaks has just released a trove of documents that is causing an international diplomatic incident. On its website, titled Espionage Elysée, the anti-privacy group showed how the U.S. National Security Agency spied on the last three of France's presidents over the past 10 years. Current President François Hollande, as well as Nicolas Sarkozy and Jacques Chirac. Not only has WikiLeaks revealed how the NSA conducted the surveillance, but also the results of the spying. Among the documents released are top-level discussions in France concerning the financial crisis, Greece's economy, its relationship with Germany, and even its position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This morning, the French government summoned U.S. Ambassador Jane Hartley to its foreign ministry to discuss the revelations. And President Hollande released a statement saying, quote, France will not tolerate any actions that threaten its security and the protection of its interests. Well, Courtney, I can't help but enjoy seeing the U.S. be embarrassed internationally over its invasive spying. But on a serious note, could this impact U.S.-French relations?
Oh, well, it certainly had a chilling effect on the relationship between the United States and Germany after the revelations that the United States was spying on Chancellor Angela Merkel's cell phone. And there continue to be tensions between the two countries, as we saw during the most recent meeting between President Obama and Chancellor Merkel. So I think it's very likely that we will see fallout from these revelations. I understand that there are more to come, and that these will certainly impact our economic and diplomatic ties with France. But I think what's most important in all of this is really the timeline. And I think what we see here is that the U.S. government has continued its global surveillance program, even after the embarrassment with Chancellor Merkel, even in the face of widespread public opposition to mass surveillance programs in the United States. What we're seeing is that despite the lip service from the Obama administration about transparency and accountability, global surveillance is really continuing without skipping a beat, and that is a problem.
The U.S. Senate took a procedural vote on Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA, yesterday and passed it 60-37, setting it up for passage within days. In fact, senators will vote on so-called fast-track authority for the Trans-Pacific Partnership today in a final vote. The entire process was restarted after the fast-track bill died in the Senate earlier. It was sent back to the House for a revote without an accompanying bill called Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA, which would have set up a fund to retrain workers whose jobs would be impacted by TPP. The House is promising to take up TAA at a later date. Speaker John Boehner, whose party has unusually partnered with President Obama on this bill, was confident that he would, quote, get TPA and TAA to the president's desk this week and deliver this win for the American people, end of quote. Well, Courtney, contrary to what Boehner says, is this a disaster for the American people?
I would say absolutely it's a disaster for American workers and really for any hope that we had of being able to hold the corporate sector accountable in the negotiations over this trade agreement. I mean, as you know, negotiations for the TPP have taken place largely in public without oversight or input from the public or Congress. And the leaked passages that we have been able to see, courtesy of WikiLeaks, are really troubling. What we're seeing is increased intellectual protections for corporations, increasing the ability of corporations to file suit against states whose domestic policies interfere with their potential profit earnings, and really a refusal, we're seeing workers' rights left at the door of the meeting room in the conversation on this trade agreement. So I think this is a truly disastrous turn of events for the American people, but a major coup for the private sector.
And finally, a horrific death toll in Pakistan is rising. More than 800 people have died from a record-breaking heat wave affecting the southern Sindh province. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has declared a national emergency, but Pakistanis are unhappy with his government's handling of the crisis and have begun protesting in various cities. The majority of the deaths have taken place in the city of Karachi. Pakistan's meteorological department told Time magazine that the heat wave was, quote, unprecedented and that it, quote, has never been this bad. A spokesperson for a non-profit organization helping to treat patients at a hospital said, "I've never seen such a big number of deaths because of a heat wave." The government has declared a public holiday for the rest of the week to encourage people to remain indoors and escape the heat. Earlier this year, more than 2,000 people in neighboring India's southern states died from a heat wave. Such extreme and record-breaking weather is wholly consistent with a warming climate. Well, Courtney, are people connecting the dots between such heat waves and climate change?
Well, certainly some people are. I mean, just earlier this month, India's Minister of Earth Sciences stated unequivocally that the cause of the heat wave and the massive loss of life is undoubtedly linked to climate change, and the science really seems to back him up on this. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report where they stated that temperatures in India were rising as a direct result of increased carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And across the board, climate scientists agree that one of the outcomes that we will see from climate change is the development of more extreme weather patterns, hotter summers, colder winters, fiercer hurricanes, and the attendant loss of life and damage to property that we'll see as a result of that. So, you know, as I've said before, I think that really what these stories show us is that the people who will be the most impacted, who were really going to bear the brunt of climate change, are populations that are already vulnerable: the ill, the elderly, children, the poor, because they lack the material resources to buffer themselves from these changes. And that is, it's a needless tragedy.
Right. And this month is the holy month of Ramadan, which is also making Pakistanis vulnerable. I want to thank you, as always, Courtney, for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Hi, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A major crisis has been playing out in the world's newest nation, South Sudan, for about half the time of its existence. Just 4 years ago, the Republic of South Sudan offered hope for peace when it split off from Sudan. But 2 years ago, fighting broke out between various groups, and there was a rise in unspeakable crimes, many aimed at women and children. Now, more than 4 million people are at risk of starvation in the landlocked African nation. The World Food Programme has struggled to send food to South Sudan, but aid workers have been targeted by fighters. Joyce Luma, the director of the WFP, has said, quote, a staggering number of people are going hungry. South Sudan has rich oil fields that are at the heart of a power struggle between various factions and the government. To make matters worse, there is now a cholera outbreak reported in the capital, Juba, with 18 people dead and 170 confirmed to be infected. My guest is Sufyan bin Uzayr. He is the author of Sufism, A Brief History. He's written about South Sudan for Counterpunch. Welcome to Uprising. Can you hear me, Sufyan? Hi, Sufyan. We're going to have to call you back since it looks like we can't reach you. Sufyan is joining us from India, where he is currently based. And again, he writes for Counterpunch, and in an article that he had written, he asked the question, is South Sudan a failed state? Back in July 2011, after a long civil war, South Sudan split from Sudan to become an independent country. However, even though statehood was achieved and a new country was born, the efforts to transform South Sudan into a proper nation-state seem to have come to a standstill. Is South Sudan a failed state? Even worse, is the country almost on the brink of collapse? And he certainly attempts to address those concerns. So we're going to try to bring Sufyan back on the air with us, so do bear with us. Also, the situation in South Sudan centers around oil fields in the city of Bor, and oil operations have resumed. And just in the middle of the crisis, as these horrific crimes are taking place, particularly aimed at children, we're seeing a resumption of relations between the president, Salva Kiir, and his former vice president, Riek Machar, who was the one who had initially split off and led a rebel opposition. Sufyan, are you with us? Can you hear me, Sufyan? Hi, Sufyan.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Great. What are the roots of the South Sudan crisis? I mean, 4 years ago, there was much hopeful talk when the country broke off from Sudan, particularly the United States said that, this would be a country in Africa that would enjoy peace and prosperity. How is what is happening today something that surprises you?
No, to be very frank, there's nothing that surprises me.
No, to be very frank, there's not.
When South Sudan broke from Sudan, it wasn't really a consideration for the people's choices, nor was it a consideration for democracy. Of course, the mainstream media decided to tell you otherwise.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Keep talking. Go ahead, Sir.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you. Keep talking.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, keep talking. We can hear you.
Okay, so what I was saying was that, 4 years ago, when South Sudan broke from Sudan, whatever was expected didn't really turn out that way. Because it was more of a forced balkanization of Africa's largest country, and it was tried to be justified on account of proper democracy and a country that the Western world and rather the free world can count on. However, unfortunately, they decided to install military leaders as democratically elected people. And as experience dictates, this is something that never works in any country. You cannot take a military general and make him contest elections and have people elect him and then project him as an elected representative of people. You cannot do that. So this is precisely where South Sudan fails. The military leaders have failed to connect with the civilians of South Sudan. What they're trying to do is they're trying to grab power in a country that is still in its infant state. That's what is happening.
So,
and this is what is leading to crisis in the country all over.
So military leaders being placed into positions of democratic leadership is part of the problem. What about the situation?
Yeah, your voice is too low. Can you...
Yeah, we can... Let me try to be as clear as I can. What about the fact that South Sudan is an oil-rich country? Does that play into the crisis?
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, your voice is just too low.
The question is, what about oil? Does oil impact this crisis?
Correct. Oil resources. See, oil had a big role to play in why South Sudan was created in the first place. The southern part of Sudan had rich oil resources, whereas the rest of Sudan was primarily an agricultural-based economy. So South Sudan, a short nation that could not survive without American and foreign aid, it was created just so the oil resources of that state would be absorbed by foreign powers, much like what was done to smaller states in the Middle East too. So this is precisely why oil resources is why South Sudan was created. If South Sudan did not have oil, just by any chance, then they wouldn't have really bothered setting up this country in the first place.
What about children in South Sudan? How vulnerable are they? We're hearing some horrific reports of children being castrated, boys being castrated, girls being gang raped. It's just awful.
Speaking of children, records of United Nations state that over 2 million children have been displaced by the conflict since 2013 till the middle of 2015, the current year. So in a year and a half, over 2 million children and women have been displaced. Over 50,000 people have been killed in the conflict, of which most are children and women. Because children and in refugee crisis are the most vulnerable. And even today, over 1 million civilians are sheltered inside overcrowded UN bases. And I stress overcrowded because UN bases have been set up at a couple of places in South Sudan, and mostly children and women, and mind you, teenage females, teenage girls, mostly, are being forced to take shelter in refugee camps set up by the United Nations.
And of course, they are very vulnerable for rape. There are reports of children being tied together before their throats are slit.
In South Sudan, the current conflict is between two parties. The first party claims to be the elected government, or so to speak of, whereas the second party, led by the then vice president, former vice president, claims to be the rightfully elected government who has been denied power. Now, both of them have half of the military support on each of their sides. So essentially, it is a civil war that is ongoing. And in a civil war, women and children are the ones who are most vulnerable because they don't have anywhere else to go. Since South Sudan, and after the balkanization in 2011, does not really have very good terms with any of its neighbors for that matter. So the refugees from South Sudan don't have anywhere to go outside the country. They cannot seek refuge in Sudan for all that matters. So they have to remain inside the country itself. As such, those children and the women, they are at the mercy of people who are fighting the civil war, and they are forced to take sides. Now, civilians cannot take sides in a civil war, because if they end up taking sides, they'll end up being killed, and this is what is happening exactly.
I want to reiterate some points to our audience because we are on a phone which isn't a very good quality. And so my guest, Sufyan bin Uzayr, maintaining that this is a civil war, two sides being led by President Salva Kiir and his former Vice President Riek Machar, who led the rebellion that began in December 2013, just 2 years after this country was formed and 2 years ago. And that conflict continues. Civilians are being overcrowded or being held in overcrowded refugee camps run by the United Nations. And in fact, just this morning, there is news that a UN camp is expanding by half and expects to hold 185,000 people. Sufyan, there is a report of a cholera outbreak now in South Sudan, which could greatly complicate things. Particularly children are, of course, vulnerable. Can you comment on the cholera crisis?
Hello?
Can you comment on the fact that there is now an outbreak of cholera?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you comment on the fact that there's an outbreak of cholera?
There's an outbreak of?
Cholera.
Yes, there's an outbreak of cholera and in fact many other diseases. And medicines and other facilities are not available to the people of South Sudan. Agreed. Let me also point out that United States themselves have recently sanctioned a big deal of aid to fight the disease outspread in South Sudan, which is nearly $97 million from USAID's Office of Food and Peace. So roughly $275 million in support of crisis responses for this year only. However, there's one more thing that is really hurting the civilians of South Sudan is corruption. The regime of South Sudan and those people who are involved in the civil war, they need funds for their weapons, either by hook or crook. So the aid that is reaching South Sudan is not really reaching the people of South Sudan. The aid is being used to finance and fund the civil war. And at this point, let me also point out that many nations, including the United States, have an implicit idea that their aid is being misused. However, if they try to stop this and the parties involved in the civil war, they are offended, there's a chance that South Sudan might just collapse. So in order to keep South Sudan alive as a country, people are allowing the civil war to prosper, and the civil war is being funded on the basis of aid that is being sent to control diseases. There is an outbreak of cholera, and there's also a serious case of malnutrition in the country. Let me tell you that too.
And just again to reiterate to our audience, my guest Sufyan bin Uzayr mentioning that not only is there an outbreak of cholera, but also a serious issue of malnutrition, and that the funds that are apparently being sent to aid in South Sudan's crisis, particularly to combat the disease, are in fact simply fueling the civil war and fueling the crisis. Finally, Sufyan, what about the role of the United States politically? What do you think needs to happen here? Can Americans pressure the U.S. government to do something about the crisis in South Sudan?
Can you please repeat the question?
I'm
sorry, your voice is too low.
What can Americans do about the crisis in South Sudan? Can Americans do something about this politically? Do you have any? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're saying what can the Americans do to control the crisis in South Sudan? That's what you're saying? What can USA do?
Yes. Do you have any recommendations for what Americans can do about this?
The American government, you mean?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, it is actually pretty straightforward, to be very honest. South Sudan, first, the aid needs to stop or be curbed down. Secondly, to solve the refugee crisis and to help the civilians, the South Sudanese rebels need to be controlled. At the moment, they're using their democratic powers to fund their military adventures in civil war, which is something that needs to be stopped at the earliest. In fact, if such serious cases of human rights violations had happened in any other country, any other country for that matter, USA probably would have found a reason to invade. Of course, military intervention is not something that is recommended, but an African commission should be set up or something like that should be done to broker a peace talk, because South Sudan, in all likelihood, cannot function as a country anymore. The referendum to separate from Sudan was wrong by all accounts, and this balkanization, this incorrect balkanization, needs to be fixed. So for now, to control the refugee crisis, efforts should be made to kill the civil war, to end the civil war. And in order for that to happen, USA needs to remove its hand from the back. USA needs to stop patting the back of people who are fighting the civil war, the military junta and the pseudo-military regimes that have been set up in the country. That would be really beneficial.
I want to thank you very much, Sufyan bin Uzayr, for joining us. He is the author of Sufism, A Brief History. He's written about South Sudan for Counterpunch, joining us by phone from Lucknow, India. And he has emphasized that aid needs to stop being sent to South Sudan because it is actually fueling the crisis, and that the U.S. can actually broker peace talks. And we do apologize for the poor quality of the phone there, but we really wanted to bring you an analysis of this very important story as South Sudan, the world's newest nation, is currently the site of unspeakable horrors, particularly impacting children. This is Uprising. When we come back, we will be inspired, I hope, by my guest Godliver Businge, who is in another African country, in Uganda. She's currently visiting the United States. She'll share her story of how she has found gender empowerment and self-determination, as well as increased access to water in her nation. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. In California, we're battling an historic drought where the rich scoff at the idea of not being able to soak their lush lawns, while produce farming in the central desert and bottled water corporations suck up many gallons of precious water. But in other parts of the world, just having access to drinking water and water for sanitation is a serious battle. One such place is the Eastern African nation of Uganda, where there has been a water crisis for decades, but where women are now taking the lead on finding technological fixes. One such woman is my guest, Godliver Businge, who works with the Global Women's Water Initiative as a technology trainer, training grassroots women all over Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania in the construction of water conservation and access technology. And she happens to be visiting the United States and joins us now via video stream. Welcome to Uprising. Now, Godliver, can you tell us how women were traditionally the carriers of water in Uganda? You grew up carrying extremely heavy containers of water on your head for long distances. Tell us a little bit about that. Godliver, we're having some problems with your audio. We really apologize. We're going to call you on the phone while you stay on your video stream. So just remain where you are and just pick up your phone. We're going to call you on the phone right now. And we do apologize for the struggles that we're having with our systems today. We are doing our best with a very, very small number of staff. So do bear with us today. We have some amazing guests on the program, and we're trying to cover some really important stories. And we're calling you right now on your phone, Godliver. So if you can simply pick up your phone as we're dialing you, that would be very helpful. Again, my guest is Godliver Businge, and we are trying to reach her to figure out what the work is that she does, to understand and be inspired by the work that she does with conservation efforts in Uganda. Can you hear me, Godliver?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about how your own childhood was marred by having to walk long distances, carrying very, very heavy containers of water, and how common that is?
Thank you very much, Sonali, for that question. I'm very glad that I'm sharing to a big group of people out there, and I'm so happy to share my story because I'm part of it. It has not been easy. It's really tough being a young girl of 6 years, carrying 40-pound liter jerrycan on your head at 6 years old. I really wonder how many kids can do that here. But in Uganda, in Africa, it's like part of life. And I used to do this a lot with my mom and would miss school most of the time because I have to walk like 2.5 kilometers to and fro. That is about 5 kilometers every day. And I knew many girls, many women out there are going through the same thing. So I thought maybe I could be a voice to the voiceless. I would be a voice to those who cannot come out and speak. And I really worked hard, struggled hard to make sure, even though things were not perfect, I keep myself going to school, and my mom was really supportive. And because of my background, this has really inspired me to go ahead.
Godliver, we're going to call you back on Skype. Unfortunately, we've lost your audio one more time, and do bear with us. We're going to try to call you immediately back. She's explaining to us how, as a 6-year-old girl, she carried a jerry can of water weighing 40 pounds on her head and walked for several kilometers at a time. This is, of course, a common issue in Uganda. Go ahead, Godliver. Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
All right. So I was saying I dedicated my life to help young girls and women out there so that they don't have to be to carry all the jerrycans on their head again. And I'm really swearing that I want to make sure that they don't have to do that again, because I really don't want to do that again. And I don't want anyone out there to do that again, because it's not really interesting. And that's what has inspired me up to where I am right now.
Now, tell us a little bit about the fact that you pursued successfully a degree in civil engineering, which is quite unusual for a woman to get a degree such as this in Uganda, and you graduated top of your class. What drew you to civil engineering?
I think earlier on, like I've explained, I grew up saying I really want to do big things. I really want to be a big woman out there one time. And in order to do that, if I have to handle water issues, I really have to maybe be an engineer, maybe design simple cost technologies that everyone can easily use. And I realized maybe if I be an engineer and do all these big things, and back home in Africa, people thought even women or girls can't do engineering courses. Actually, when you do it, people even up to some time, people would say, who is going to marry me if I climb on top of the roof?
Who is going to marry you?
Yes, because an African woman should not climb the roof or should not climb the tank to roof a house. That is like a bad omen or curse. But I said I had to challenge all this. I had to go ahead despite what people would say. So I went through vocational studies, doing bricklaying and concrete practice, and kept.
Okay, I'm so sorry. We just lost your audio again. And what we're going to do is call you on the phone. So if you can hold the phone up to your ear while you remain on video with us, we should hopefully not have this problem repeat with our audio dropping, whether because of internet or some other technical issues. And I do apologize both to our audience and to my guest, Godliver Businge, who is visiting from Uganda. She's visiting the United States. And we are going to try to call her right on the phone. There we go. Do we have you? And in just about a minute, we hope to have her with us. Here we go. Can you hear me? Yeah, we shouldn't lose you now. Can you continue your answer?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you continue your answer? Go ahead. Go ahead with your answer.
Yeah. As I was explaining, I thought if I become an engineer and maybe I can be able to work like direct and be able to design different appropriate technologies that are easy to be done or replicated by people, by women and girls. And I wanted also to challenge gender stereotypes because it was really terrible growing up and everyone telling you you can't climb a tree, you can't roof a house, you can't all the time. And I thought, why can't I do it? But all this has not been easy. Like in my class, we were 29 and I was the only girl in class. And even the teacher would tell me, are you going to manage this, Godliver? And then I'm like, just give me the work and I try it. And if I fail, then comment. And what was interesting, every time we did like practicals or we are in an exam, I would turn out to be the best. So this has really been a great opportunity for me because I even managed to be the best in my class in 2012, and I was even given an opportunity to give a speech on behalf of my class, and the Minister of Education from Uganda offered me a job, which I declined because I had big plans ahead of me. I had a vision to continue with school, get masters, get a PhD, and go out in communities and train women so that they can be like me. So I felt
Godliver,
sitting in an office would not be the right thing to do, but
I want to just ask you
go out and work with the women.
How have you trained women, and the work that you've done with your civil engineering degree, how have you trained them to build tanks in their own homes? How has the work that you've done actually helped to change the way in which girls have to carry, water long distances? Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
How has your work actually, fixed in some cases this problem of girls having to walk long distances to carry water from, to and from their villages? Have you seen real results with the work that you're doing?
Sorry, I can't hear well.
Can you tell us how you have actually impacted girls on the ground, your work?
Okay, with our work, we have a real big impact. Like we work with schools, and then we work with the youth, we work with women, and currently over 222 women have been trained by Global Women's Water Initiative, and in particular, me, Godliver, because I'm a technology trainer, and over maybe like about 10,000 girls or pupils have really directly benefited from me because when I'm implementing in schools, I work with them hand in hand and try to teach them how to do this. So, and also in the technical school where I was trained, every time I get a chance, I give a radio program. And there's been a big turn-up of girls in a school, in that technical school, Uganda Rural Development and Training Program. The turn-up for girls has increased, and many are no longer taking, like, tailoring and hairdressing. Many are now taking, like, mechanics and engineering, bricklaying. And it's so amazing and inspiring for me when you hear these girls say, we want to be like Godliver. So I think we have made a big impact out there.
How does what you see in the United States, how do you compare, for example, our water use here in the U.S.? I mean, California has a major drought right now, and yet people still water their lawns But in Uganda, people, are grateful just to have a tank in their home to have water to drink and for sanitation and to cook with.
Yeah, I know. This is really challenging. Like now, I've been here in California, and you still have challenges to do with water, but people still manage to even irrigate their gardens and do that.
Yeah.
And back in Uganda, we are also blessed with all these water bodies and sources, but we also have a challenge with our government, like they are not extending these services to the rural people. So someone might even have a lake just around them, but they can't even access the water from the lake. And maybe I would feel our government should come in, but it's not. So I feel this is where we non-profit organizations come in to fill in this gap. At least say let's use appropriate technologies like rainwater harvesting tanks, install them in people's houses, install them in schools so that women don't have to suffer. At least they have some water to take care of their families and do all the family chores, the house chores. So I think maybe with doing that, with the work we are doing out there in Africa, in East Africa, maybe the government, I believe the government is already seeing the change that we are creating. And that's why we have a big number now of about 10 women appointed on local water boards. This is like district or government level where they can influence issues. And before this was not done. So I feel we are being acknowledged and people are saying we are doing a great work. And we believe that the government soon is going to respond and everything will be great.
Finally, Godliver, are there any lessons that you can share with us here in the United States about the work that you're doing? Because we also have a problem of gender inequality. We also have a problem in our educational system that young girls don't feel as though they're as capable as boys to enter such fields as civil engineering.
I think the message I should give, like, to people in the States, I think people should look at me. I'm out here all the way from Uganda, from East Africa, and speaking now on radio. That, first of all, that should be a great inspiration to all the young girls out there, all the people who are listening to this. And I feel it's really a great opportunity for the women to come up and take like these engineering courses, because at least we stand out and we are not marginalized. At least we are not saying we want to be the superpowers beyond men. We really have to work alongside with men. But it's great when women come out so that at least there is gender equality in all these things. And I'm so happy and proud of the work I do, because I see how much I'm appreciated on ground, how the kids are so happy to see me work, even young kids saying that I want to be like Godliver when I grow up. For me, that is some big thing, and I'm calling upon girls to go ahead, take up these courses, challenge the world.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck to you in everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Sonali. Thank you very much.
My guest, Godliver Businge, works with the Global Women's Water Initiative as a technology trainer, training grassroots women all over Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania in the construction of water conservation and access technology. And she's visiting the United States right now. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll examine the presidential candidacy of Jeb Bush, but specifically how the Bush family has major ties to Wall Street and how Mr. Bush plans on likely using those ties. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush has been polling surprisingly well in New Hampshire, a swing state. He leads the pack of nearly 20 GOP presidential hopefuls, even though in the crucial state of Iowa, he polled behind Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. On his website, Bush tells the romantic tale of how he met his wife, Columba, in Mexico during an exchange program. He also admits, quote, "I know I'm unique in that I have a brother and a father who have both served in this nation as president." But Jeb Bush has had to work hard at distancing himself from his brother, George, who was arguably the most reviled president in the nation's history. What he's also obscuring are his family's deep connections to Wall Street. Joining me now is Nomi Prins, journalist and senior fellow at Demos. Her books include Black Tuesday, It Takes a Pillage Behind the Bonuses, Bailouts, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street, Other People's Money, The Corporate Mugging of America, and her latest, All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. She's also a former investment banker at Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, and Lehman Brothers, and she just published a piece on Tom Dispatch based on an excerpt from All the President's Men entitled All In, The Bush Family Goes for Number 3 with the help of its bankers. Welcome to Uprising, Nomi. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Well, first, can you tell us a little bit about what specifically we need to be paying attention to when it comes to the Bush family? This would be the first time, if Jeb Bush did indeed become the nominee and went on to become the president, that you would have 3 administrations from the very same family. You've pointed out that their Wall Street ties run really deep, all the way back to George H.W. Bush and his ancestors. Can you hear me, Nomi?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Can you tell us how far back the ties go between Wall Street and the Bush family, just sort of historically?
Yeah, they basically go back almost 100 years, actually more than 100 years, to George H.W. Walker, who was an investment banker and had a company by that name, by their last name, who's the great-great-great-grandfather of Jeb Bush. And his company ultimately was acquired by Merrill Lynch, which was acquired by Bank of America in 2008 during the financial crisis. So there's a through line through the Merrill Lynch connection into Bank of America more recently that goes back to really the turn of the century, last century, the early 1900s. So that's where a long tail element of the Wall Street connection to the Bush family, or one side of the Bush family, but of course it also emerges together as the generations go forward, that has been in existence for that long a period of time. And of course there's the more recent connections which have been related more to appointments through Goldman Sachs, with Hank Paulson being an appointed Treasury Secretary to George W. Bush in 2006, and all the relationships with Goldman Sachs that entailed as well, and continues to entail and will become prominent, more prominent into this election.
So, Nomi, what about the fact that Jeb Bush is likely going to be calling on these Wall Street friends of his? Are they already pouring money into his campaign? Do we see any evidence yet?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence. First of all, there's a couple things. One is that even before he announced his candidacy for his nomination for the Republican ticket, they were already gathering together, particularly in Wall Street, and a lot of the CEOs that were connected to Wall Street CEOs. For example, the Wall Street Journal in December of last year, 2014, ran a poll across the Republican candidates and potential candidates where 73% of the most senior CEOs, many of them with ties on Wall Street or on Wall Street, wanted Jeb to be the candidate for the Republican ticket. So this was before he even was going to run. And we should really note that the whole sort of dance around when he was going to actually officially announce his nomination and everything, what happens in these circles, the large money circles, these family connections that go on for centuries, that have all of these power ties, is that everybody knew in that collection of individuals that he was going to run. There was never any question. The only issue was the timing with which he would announce it to the American public, which he did more recently. But they already knew. Another example, though, since he announced it, just this last couple of weeks, is they had a large donor call for one of his 4 super PACs. And on that call, the leader of that particular super PAC, Right to Power, was basically telling the donors that they had already raised $17 million in a very short period just for that super PAC. And this is out of the full amount, the $80 to $100 million that the Jeb Bush group had said they were planning to raise by the middle of this year, so really by the end of this month. So that was one PAC in one tri-state area raising, at that point, $17 million. I would think by now, a couple of days later, it's $20 million. And that's just one aspect of his fundraising capabilities. It relates more to Wall Street CEOs or hedge fund managers, or basically people within the upper echelons of the finance community.
And Nomi, can we, looking back at the previous 2 Bush presidencies, can we see a revolving door between Wall Street executives and members of the Bush cabinets to get a sense of what Jeb Bush is going to do? Is there going to be this real connection with actual people moving from positions of power in Wall Street into government positions because their benefactor, because Jeb Bush is thanking his benefactors?
Well, absolutely. The issue of these kind of power families and these political dynasties, of which the Bush one would be the preeminent one in American history if Jeb Bush were to become president, is that you do pay back, the people that provided you favors and money, and not just money individually, but collected money because of their stature along the way. And we saw that actually going back to even Jeb Bush's father, the first Bush that was in office, where one of the Treasury secretaries when he was vice president that Ronald Reagan appointed was Don Regan, who was in fact the Merrill Lynch CEO at the time, and that was a Bush connection. Nicholas Brady, another Treasury secretary during that time, a Bush connection. So there's definitely this idea of picking people that are friends. And of course, Hank Paulson, a Bush connection under George W., becoming the Treasury secretary. There's no reason to assume that Jeb Bush won't pick someone from the street to become, the Treasury Secretary or one of the senior economic advisors. That's another role that a lot of these people typically play. If it's not officially the Treasury Secretary, it's the unofficial head of the National Council or the economic advisor to the president. But regardless, that's a person that has a lot of power with respect to financial policy, economic policy, and having the president's ear, and also, of course, receiving the favor from Jeb Bush, who were to be president, in return for their support along the way. And it should be noted that not only do these favors go back and forth and have gone back and forth for generations of the Bush family and other powerful families in the presidency, but there's a lot behind this one. It is the 3rd time. All of the power of living individuals on Wall Street and within the Bush family connections currently, in our current period of time in history, all of that is galvanized now behind this 3rd person. They have just no interest in losing. The people that back him have no interest in losing, and they know that as a result there are favors that will be willingly distributed, regardless of what may or may not be said publicly to the American population in a potential Jeb Bush presidency.
Right. One of the things that you bring up in your piece is the now sort of forgotten crisis of Enron in the early 2000s. And you point out how G.W. Bush ended up obscuring that, the fallout from Enron very conveniently when the September 11th attacks happened. Can you remind us what happened there, and if that is an indication of the kind of president his brother Jeb might be?
Yeah, there was a timing with the Enron scandal, which was a large poster child for fraud in the energy sector. But of course, Enron was not just an energy company; it was an energy company that worked with a lot of Wall Street banks, as well as with its own financial individuals, trading, hiding things, creating all of these books that were non-transparent to shareholders of Enron or to anybody, that were models of some of the things that were created by the banks at the time, that are still created actually by banks at the time, and with the partners, some of the banks that we are talking about, have just been talking about now, such as Merrill Lynch. They were key components of helping Enron with some of its shady dealings, some of the things that it put off its books so that people, shareholders, regulators, and so forth couldn't see what they were doing. Of course, Enron ultimately imploded in a kind of it unfolded over a couple of months. There were some very senior officials on Wall Street and in Washington trying to keep it from imploding, but it did anyway. And it happened to have been in the beginning of the beginning of the fall of 2001, when a lot of the problems at Enron, this illegality, the fraud that was culminating at Enron, of course, with the CEO there, Ken Lay, who was a Bush family friend, and a Cheney connection, Dick Cheney, who was the vice president at the time under George W. All of this was coming to a head, but concurrently, what had also just come to a head was 9/11. And so there was this juxtaposition of what was happening on a sort of grander scale, the fight against now the threat of terrorism and what happened in 9/11, and Bush George W. Bush diverting attention from these scandals that were now not just at Enron, but they're actually enveloping the entire energy sector, because many of the deals that Enron had done in a huge way, other energy companies based in Texas, where the Bushes have a lot of ties and so forth, were also doing some of the same things, just on a slightly smaller scale. So all this is going on while George W. is really diverting attention with his advisors to what needs to be done with respect to the terrorist attack. And one of the things he did out of the gate at 9/11, while the Enron stuff was going in the background and 9/11 had just occurred, was that he actually urged the SEC at the time to, for example, reduce some requirements in terms of trading limits, so that when the markets opened back up after the first couple days of the period around 9/11, there would be a tremendous surge in the ability of the larger banking institutions to kind of make a play and raise the markets, and Bush put it in terms of, if we raise the markets, we raise America. And it became this idea that the bankers, Wall Street, and so forth are really the engine of how America will show itself to be strong in the face of terrorism. And of course, a couple of years later, we have the war in Iraq. But during that period of time, what was going on was all the other corporate frauds were coming out, and the bank associations with these corporate frauds were coming out. Everything was really coming to a head in 2002 and into 2003 before the war in Iraq. So it was sort of a dance between what could be focused on in terms of foreign policy and military policy with what was going on in the financial community, and with corporate policy and corporate frauds from the standpoint of the White House, the Bush White House, being kept on the back burner.
And of course, a few years later, G.W. Bush would go on to help out his banker friends once more with a massive bailout in the wake of the recession. Now, let's talk about the fact that during Jeb Bush's presidential campaign, we have a very different political and financial landscape in terms of these super PACs, political action committees that have been enabled by the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. The flood of money from Wall Street and Wall Street executives has already been shown to be unprecedented in the last two elections. What do we know about super PAC money flooding Jeb Bush's campaign so far? Can you name some names about who he counts among his top backers?
Well, at the moment, one of the things is that it won't be until July that we get an official report of three of his super PACs. He has four super PACs. The fourth one, it's a 501(c), and it's basically not required to give any public information on donors or the particular amounts for them. So one of his four super PACs, we may never know exactly who gave what, and by a result of that, it's likely to be a pretty big total figure. But in some of the other super PACs, we do know that the individuals who have already been having large ticket dinners for him, like Henry Kravitz, who's a large billionaire brokerage company head on, or hedge fund company head on Wall Street, has already had $100,000 per person gatherings at his Park Avenue home. So you tally up something like that, you get $1 million with 10 people walking in the door. And so those kinds of things have been going on, and they continue to be planned. My guess, and again, we don't know, but judging from the call where there was a number that was issued of $17 million, which I believe right now is probably at least around $20 million for one super PAC that is going to have to disclose information. And the other three, I mean, I think he does come very close to the $80 to $100 million target for going through the middle of this year when we actually get some of the main figures in July. There are other Wall Street figures, for example, that haven't yet had a number attached to their name, but are going to be involved or have been involved in some capacity. John Thain, for example, who was a former number 2 at Goldman Sachs, under Hank Paulson, when Hank Paulson became Treasury Secretary, before he became Treasury Secretary, John Thain ultimately went to become the CEO of Merrill Lynch, that company we talked about before, as well as head of the New York Stock Exchange before that. And as a favor almost to Merrill Lynch when it was imploding in the financial crisis of 2008, Hank Paulson and others in Washington enabled it to be taken over by Bank of America and enabled John Thain and others to get big bonuses at the time as well. So he's definitely going to be someone in there trying to either give money from himself, raise it into super PACs, have that sort of outside group donors that the candidates are able to have in this particular election, which will make this the most expensive election by far in history.
Finally, Nomi, we of course will be discussing a lot on this program Hillary Clinton's candidacy, and the Clintons certainly aren't immune from the same kind of Wall Street ties. We just have about a minute left. In a minute, can you hint to us what we should also be worried about with the Clinton presidency's ties to Wall Street?
Exactly. I mean, it's exactly the same thing, quite frankly, with respect to Wall Street. Whatever, again, it says publicly, the ties are pretty much the same with slightly different people. I talked about Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, John Thain, the Republican side of Goldman Sachs and former Goldman Sachs, very rich and powerful executive. But then Hillary Clinton, of course, has the Robert Rubin contingent, the Democratic contingent, and has a lot of backing herself from Goldman Sachs. She has a lot of backing from Citigroup, and Bank of America will be backing Bush. So, you have this split on Wall Street where either way, either candidate, there's been tremendous history, tremendous support, tremendous money, tremendous alignment of ideologies in Palestine. Honestly, whichever candidate wins the presidency, and it will come down to Hillary versus Jeb, Wall Street's going to be taken care of, and there will be a status quo there, and they will all have donated money to their favorite candidates along the way.
So certainly Wall Street isn't taking any chances by funding both sides, and that definitely ends up happening election after election. Nomi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
My guest, Nomi Prins, is a senior fellow at Demos. She's the author of the book, All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. She's also a former investment banker at Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, and Lehman Brothers. And she has written a piece based on her book, or based on an excerpt from her book, All the President's Bankers, that we will post a link to at uprisingwithsonali.com. That does it for today's program. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our research intern and our audio engineer. Special thanks to Federico Garcia as well. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.